So we are in John chapter 19 today. John chapter 19. I don't know about you all, but I really enjoy eating. Can I get an amen on that? I was just reflecting, Ed.
I was going to say, one of my security things, I probably should mention, they say, what are your favorite pastimes? Go eating.
Yeah. I love that. I remember probably one of the best meals that I've ever had was on my honeymoon. My wife and I were looking through this magazine of local restaurants in this area of Mexico that we were in, and we weren't familiar with this, but they had this magazine there, and there was this one that was like, oh, there's this eccentric chef, and he'll make a meal for you. And I was like, well, that sounds interesting. So we decided to go there, and turns out it was this really little home, and there was this big kitchen that took up like half of the home and like 6 tables that you could sit at and watch them create stuff. And I was like, wow, this is going to be a whole experience. That was neat. And the chef came right up to our table and started asking us questions about our likes and dislikes and food and all of that. And he decided just to make stuff based on that conversation. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And then they started bringing out appetizers, one at a time. And it was fascinating because it was a multi-course meal. And I was like, oh, this just keeps coming. And about the time that the entrees came out, best steak that I had ever had, that was incredible, melt in your mouth kind of thing. I started to think, you know what? We didn't look at a menu. I have no idea what's coming next. And it's like the meal just kept coming and coming and coming. And then I began to think, I wonder how much this is going to cost. Look at a menu.
One dinner on the honeymoon. You're in debt for the rest of your life.
Yeah, there you go. It turns out that was the most expensive meal that I've ever had, also. But it was great.
So
But
much for chicken nuggets.
yeah, exactly. No, it was fantastic. But just the fact that it just kept going deeper and deeper into all these different things for us to try, all these meals that just kept getting better. I was like, there's no way that this could be even better than it is. Oh wow, it is. Of course, it was really expensive, but that didn't matter. The cost didn't matter at the end. And I kind of, at the time actually I didn't, but it turned out fine. No, we were able to pay for it and everything, but it was really good. But I felt like that with this passage that we're about to jump into. Last week I said, we could be done with John next week and jump right into Genesis in our Old Testament survey. I'm going to be surprised if we get through 19 because it's going to unravel like a little appetizer and then another meal, and then we're just like, can we chew on this for a little bit? Except the nice thing is we don't really need to ask how much is this going to cost, can we pay for it, because our Savior has paid all of that for us and just gives us all of this blessing. And so I hope you came ready to eat, because this is going to be immense. And that's not to even mention then the discussion and questions that I'm sure will come up that I'm excited to get into as well. This is very, very rich. And of course we should expect that from the Word of God. But I think this passage, John brings in so many different things, you might be amazed. I know I was. So let's get into this here. We're in John chapter 19. We'll read a section and then unpack it a little bit together. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and were slapping his face. And Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you and let you know I find no grounds for charging him." And then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and a purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. And so Pilate said to him, Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given to you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." And when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was noon, or about noon, rather. Then he told the Jews, "Here is your king." And they shouted, take him away, crucify him." And Pilate said, "Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And then he handed him over to be crucified. We'll stop there and take this chunk and kind of work our way through that a little bit at a time. So, what are some things that stand out to you in this first section, verses 1 through 16 there?
When Jesus says, "We don't have the authority except given by above,"
Yeah.
and he didn't mean Caesar.
This couldn't happen to anybody else.
Mhm.
Wouldn't happen to anybody else, but because of prophecy it did.
That's right. Jesus is fulfilling so many prophecies throughout this whole process, his whole life on earth. But yeah, he's the only one who could fulfill all of these.
In verse 6 it says, "As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they said crucified." But not the people.
Mhm.
It was just the Pharisees and stuff like that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is the leadership of the Jews, the ones who were looking for the Messiah. He's right in front of them, and they are the ones that lead the people. And I believe, I did not verify this, but I believe the other Gospels, the crowd starts shouting that as well. But if you take John, it seems like then they start it, and then the crowd follows. So they're the leaders, right? They are starting this whole thing. That is very sad.
Mob mentality is so,
Mhm.
people just build each other up, psych each other out.
Yeah. But let's even dig into that further. What is the job of the priests? Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I had one more thing.
Yeah.
Pilate's order of progression is kind of weird.
Yeah.
Take Jesus, scourge him, put
Uh-huh.
crown of thorns on him, have him slapped about, bring him out. Don't find anything wrong with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's that all about?
Good question. So we talked about the illegality of Jesus' trial in this whole thing. It basically was a sham. They broke all of their Jewish laws, and I'm less familiar with the Roman law, but Pilate is very weird with this. One of the commentators that I read on this week had an interesting thing to say about that point, where he said that Pilate is trying to get out of this. He almost like, if you look at some other rulers in the Bible, like King Xerxes out of Esther, they're like these non-rulers. They're the figureheads of the state, but they're so lazy and incompetent as leaders. And Pilate is like, I want to have nothing to do with this. In the other Gospels, we see him washing his hands of it, right? And I find nothing wrong. But what this commentator pointed out is he's like, he keeps getting sucked into it, and he keeps trying to do things to appease them. So last week we saw, okay, guys, let's put on this show. Here's Barabbas, here's Jesus. Which one do you want to release? And they pick the criminal. So he goes step 2. He's like, okay, I don't want to crucify this guy. I'll have him flogged. They're out for blood. So step 2, he has him flogged. Then he brings him out, and he's like, here's the man. They're still not satisfied. They're like, no, we want you to kill him. Torturing him is not enough. You've got to kill him. So he goes even deeper into it. He's like, should I crucify your king? Yeah, crucify him, right? So they're kind of driving it, and he's trying to steer it away and not be culpable, I guess. But,
And then they threaten him with Caesar.
yeah, which
I'm
is...
gonna go tell Caesar if you don't.
That's a good move too, because historically what was happening with Pilate is, and this is probably why he's trying to get out of this whole thing, because he's already he's on his 3rd strike, basically. He's had a lot of riots in the town, and a lot of people who are claiming to be messiahs have actually risen up in the recent past. There's been some insurrections. Some people think that was what Barabbas was, as a possible messiah figurehead, or at least a rebel leader that had been put down. And so Pilate is basically, his higher up, Caesar, has been like, hey, dude, you've got one more chance. If you blow it, you're done in that role. And so he's trying not to have this issue. He recognizes that Jesus is causing all these crowds to come and that there has been some riots, but he's trying to peacefully put this down because he I think recognizes if you kill this guy, maybe his followers are going to rise up and now I'm going to have a bigger problem. But the chief priests are now saying, hey, we're going to tell your boss. And he's like, okay, fine. That I don't want that. So, yeah, there's a lot of political things here.
And it all looks like they're doing it for power.
Yes.
Because
Mhm.
they had to find something he wasn't doing in their laws, but they broke all their laws
Yes.
to do that.
Absolutely. And we know that it's power because there's been at least once, maybe twice, that John has told us that, and we actually had a quote from some of them too. They are afraid that Rome is going to take away their place. And we talked about, that was several chapters ago, we talked about how that place likely refers to their position of authority and power, but also like the temple and the fact that they can worship there in the temple. Rome might destroy that, which is very insightful because Rome did destroy it in AD 70 after there was another rebellion that came up, and Jesus predicted that that would happen. So they're worried about losing the temple. Why is that ironic, though? We want to worship God. We don't want to lose this temple. So let's crucify the Son of God.
It's kind of like doing something bad to save something that you know is good, which is never right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I find it interesting that they're basically accusing him of blasphemy, which is the one sin that they could kill somebody for.
Mm-hmm.
And now they just want Pilate to do it instead of them.
Yep.
They
Yep.
can do it in their law, but under Roman, they couldn't even
Yeah.
stone a person.
That's
at
right.
all. They're not
Right.
allowed to kill anyone, they had to go to trial.
Yep.
But I don't understand, I never could understand why, they chose, because Rome was against the riots.
Right.
And there were a lot of them. And, Jesus never did a riot, I mean, he never
Yeah.
did anything, so I don't, but still,
I think Pilate was afraid that was gonna start right there.
Yeah.
Well, it was, but it wasn't gonna be Jesus causing it.
Right. It's the chief priests that are
But he's
stirring up the
he's
people.
crux of it. He's the
Yeah.
whole point of it.
Uh-huh.
The people were following him.
But as soon as they found out that Jesus was not guilty, he claimed it, that he doesn't see it, he went against the rules of Rome then by legalizing the death
Mhm.
of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's yeah, not a good thing all the way around.
How it knows straddle the fence so long, couldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Just could hang on this very long enough.
Isn't it also, it's so interesting that there's a lot of statements that Pilate makes and a lot of the characterization. He's in the Bible for such a short amount of time, but we know so much about, we remember so much about Pilate, you know, the washing of the hands, things like that. A lot of the things that he says, what is truth, they've become so iconic. It's amazing. Were you going to say something?
I still enjoy when God brings his word and it creates a picture in my mind. A few years ago, we were over by Blue Springs and there was a lake. We were at the lake one day having a good time. Tree growing up beside the lake. Well, it turned out that it was a thorn tree.
Mm.
And the thorns were at least 2 to 3 inches long.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of thorns on a rose bush or those little da-da-da, but these thorns on that thorn tree, I mean, tree is 40 feet tall, and the thorns growing it are 2 to 3 inches long. And I'm just thinking, whoa, because if they weaved the crown of thorns,
Mhm.
they didn't use a rose bush,
Right.
They used something like that,
That's right. Yeah.
and they didn't put it on his head gently. You know, it.
Yeah.
It's amazing how people want to belittle people even in that situation.
Mhm.
You know, doing that, the purple, everything was to be made a joke of.
Mhm.
When he does wear a crown, he is royal.
Yeah. It is very ironic. You have all these symbols of being a king that they're meaning to mock him, but yet we recognize it's like, well, that is who he is.
I just can't believe that God knew he was going to be suffering, but didn't ease the pain a little bit from those big long thorns.
I know, isn't it incredible?
You know, the blood might have been coming down, but surely it didn't ease the pain
Yeah.
enough.
He wanted to, even though, you know, with as the scriptures say, with the pain set before him, he humbled himself even to the death of the cross. And you know, when he was praying in the garden and praying, you know, if it's your will, take this cup from me, not my will, but your will be done. And he drank that cup of God's wrath, every single drop of it, and that suffering that, yeah, as the Son of God, he could have avoided that. He could have dulled the pain, but he didn't. And as we talked about looking at Hebrews, as the creator of the universe, he's upholding all things. That's in Hebrews 1, which means that as the crown of thorns is on his head, he's holding the atoms together in the crown of thorns, right? And the nails that's holding him to the cross. Can you imagine? Right? And that's incredible. But, you know.
Romans, they didn't invoke any of their laws or their ideas of, not laws, but their ideas of God, you know, to confront Jesus or anything like that. There's never been any argument about, you see what I'm getting at? Or maybe not. But.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Pilate doesn't argue about the spirituality, like bringing his beliefs to Jesus. Yeah, that's an interesting one. He questions him and doesn't get a lot of good answers that satisfy him. But I think when he becomes afraid of Jesus when they say, this is in verse 7, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. That would have spoken to him because Greek and Roman culture with their gods, there's hundreds of stories of gods coming down in human form or demigods or things like that. And so a lot of people think that that's what Pilate now starts thinking. He's like, hold on a minute. Could the stories that I have read come true? And so he responds here. Now, this is speculation, but we have to acknowledge that that's the kind of stuff the Romans talked about. Verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he made himself the Son of God, he was more afraid than ever. Well, that's kind of interesting. So he goes back and he says, where are you from? He's just trying to wrap his head, is this true? Luke tells us also that Pilate's wife has been troubled with dreams about Jesus and says have nothing to do with this man. So that's probably also contributing to this fear as well. But then Jesus doesn't give him a straight answer. And so he's, or no answer actually at this point, verse 9, but Jesus did not give him an answer. And so then that's when he goes to the authority part. But it's really interesting that Jesus doesn't answer him on that point. But I think so he doesn't argue with him based on his Roman beliefs, but perhaps, again, the speculation, perhaps they're informing his thoughts at this point. But, yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about prophecies as we go, and John's going to help us with that a little bit. I've got some cross-references that I'll probably start writing on the board for us here too, because there's a lot of them. But also, let's see if we can point out, along with the prophecies, some of the types that are fulfilled in Jesus as well. We see a lot of them start to be fulfilled here. Remember, a type is something that we see in the Old Testament that is someone or something that truly happened or existed, a moment in time, a person, an object, those kind of things that seem like they point forward to Jesus. Okay? And God deliberately set these things up. So one of them that we've talked about already that we're going to see a great example of here in a minute is Isaac, right? Abraham and Isaac are going, God has asked him to sacrifice Isaac, and Isaac willingly goes, right? So it's a story, a situation that really happened. That's important. This is not a made-up fable, right? It's a historical moment in time that actually happened, and Isaac is representative of Jesus. He's not Jesus, but he's a picture of Jesus. Not everything corresponds one-to-one, but a lot of them do, and it's like, ooh, interesting. And that's part of what Jesus is fulfilling. So it's like prophecy, but slightly different. It's a story that foreshadows Jesus. That's what a type is. So we're going to look at Isaac here in a minute, but already we're going to continue to see some glimpses of another one that's maybe a little bit less familiar to you. Maybe not. And this is Jesus as a type, or fulfilling the type of Adam. Okay? So we'll get a couple of thoughts on here as we go as well. And I forgot to write down this reference, but I believe this is in Romans chapter 10, would be a place to go in case you're curious about this one. One thing that we do have to be careful with types, some early Christian writers said there's not a scrap of wood, actually I think they said a splinter of wood in the Old Testament that people have not said, this represents the cross about, and that represents an extreme. Like we shouldn't, every time we see a piece of wood, say that is a type. Not sometimes a piece of wood is a piece of wood. So the safest road to go down is to look at what the writers in the scriptures bring up to us as types, and then also what prophecies sometimes are linked to some of them as well. And then the other ones we can kind of hold loosely. It's like, boy, that really does seem like Jesus. That reminds us of Jesus. But sometimes we can go a little bit too far with these. But here's one that Paul brings up, and hopefully I have the right chapter here. I may have missed this one. Yeah, I think I maybe got the wrong chapter. Let me double check here. Yeah, I did not get the right one. Let me look around just a little bit more. Could be an 8. Okay. I'll find it a little bit later, but there are two places that Paul talks about Adam and a comparison with Christ. If I can't find it in today, maybe somebody else will as we go along, and if not, I will find those by the end of today, and I'll get those posted on the board for us. But one is in Romans, and the other one is in Corinthians. And again, off the top of my head, I always forget if it's first or second. I'm pretty sure it's second. But what he talks about there is he talks about Jesus in 2 Corinthians as the second Adam. And so that's where he actually uses that phrase. And it's really interesting. It's like, okay, so Jesus is fulfilling Adam in some way. And the other place in Romans, he doesn't mention Adam by name, but he talks about the first man, which is Adam. And he talks about where through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin. And then he starts paralleling that and says, then the same thing through Christ, one man, now we have life to all men and righteousness. And so he kind of has that comparison. So again, that's one of those. Is 5? Okay, thank you. I guess I should divide by 2 then. Okay, Romans 5.
Romans 5:12 through 21.
Thank you.
1 Corinthians 15:21.
Is it 1 Corinthians? Okay.
1 Corinthians.
Ah, okay.
For as in Adam all dies, and in Christ all have been made alive. Is that the one you wanted?
Yep, I think so. Okay, so
1 Corinthians 15,
Romans 5:12 we'll start with.
21 through 22.
Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death spread to all people because all sinned. In fact, sin was in the world before the law, but sin is not charged to a person's account where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam's transgression. He is the type of the coming one. And by the way, that's also where we get the word type and start to apply it to these other situations. So we have here Adam, and he is comparing him. Now, we could go into a lot of detail here into this passage. There's a lot of things to try to understand, like what does he mean that sin was in the world before the law and all of that. We're not going to go into that part today. But what I want you to see is that Paul is bringing up Adam and saying, Adam and Jesus have some similarities. In this situation, Adam is kind of a negative example. Isaac's the positive example. Here's some amazing things that Isaac did, And, here's how it compares to Jesus. In this situation, here's all these problems that happened with Adam. Adam sins, and now we have death, and death spreads to all men. But in Jesus, we have life, and life spreads to all men. And so there's that comparison. Okay? And then what was that passage one more time then for the 1 Corinthians?
15. 1 Corinthians 15, 21 through 22.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
There's another one that says 1545, the first Adam.
Ah,
The
yeah. I think that's...
First Adam became a living being, the last Adam a living, giving spirit. So I don't know
Yes.
which one you want. of the
Both
two.
of those.
Okay.
Yeah, he goes on one of his side tracks there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the other one is 1545, First Corinthians.
Okay.
45 or
15.
Yeah. So here again, same kind of idea. Death through one man, and resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. Just as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all are made alive. So you have that kind of idea. Then he goes on a kind of a rant into the, I should just remember that this is in the resurrection passage. If anyone challenges you on the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15 is the place to go to talk to them about that. Yeah. In verse 45, so it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So there's your comparison again. What I love about that second one is Paul is also giving you the... he's also giving you the Old Testament quotation there. So that's when God breathes life into Adam, and Adam became a living being. So Adam has life. What's ironic is that he brings death to all men, but God gave the life. He stripped life away from us, and then Jesus is now the life-giving spirit, and he brings that life back in. So that's all of that. Why am I bringing all of that up here with John? How is it that John tells us, or where do we see Adam in Christ in John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16, where we are so far? This one's a little bit hard to see.
Ask your question again.
Yeah. Where do we see Adam showing up here? Jesus fulfilling the second Adam role.
Behold the man.
Yeah, that's one of them. That's kind of an interesting one. It's just the statement that Pilate says, "Behold the man," or "Here is the man," right? And that is very reminiscent of how Adam is talked about in Genesis. God created man and placed him in the garden, and just talking about man, it's like, here is the man. And Adam is referred to as the man. Now, does Pilate mean that? No. But to us, it kind of gives us a little chuckle. It's like, yes, behold, the man. Now, there's more we can say on that in just a minute, but I think that that's really an important one that just kind of goes, that reminds me of Adam. And that's a lot of times what literature does for us, and God writes here with literary techniques, where we start to recognize, oh, this character from this story reminds me of this one over here. I recognize that one, haha, And so it just kind of gives us this moment as Christians where we can say, you meant it for evil, Pilate, but God meant it for good. Here's one. Let's go earlier. So we've got one here. Pilate said, here is the man. We talked about the crown of thorns. That's the other one. And that's kind of the main one that's here right now. That's really interesting. So Adam, God told him to be fruitful and multiply, right? But he also said to rule over the earth and subdue it. And so a lot of scholars have talked quite a bit about how the theme of kingship starts in Genesis, moves through Abraham, and then eventually when Israel gets their own kings. And every single time, all of these ruler figures, these king figures, are pointing to Christ, and all of them fail to rule. Adam failed to rule over creation. He failed to rule over his family. And there's basically this failure of kingship. And Adam essentially is kind of like the first human king, if you think about it, because, you know, he is our ancestor. Our federal head is the term that people use for him. So in a way, he kind of represents humanity as like the king, even though it doesn't explicitly say that. He's the first man, right? And now here is Jesus, who's being crowned as the last Adam or the second Adam. But what's very interesting is he's not being crowned with the crown that he deserves, but he's being crowned with a crown of thorns that's really Adam's inheritance. Because as the curse happened, that curse brought thorns into the world, right? And so as Adam is producing his crops, now there's going to be thorns. And so that's representative of the curse of creation. Okay? Okay, there's a whole lot more to be said just on this that I think is really important. I know we're going way into the weeds, haha, but I think that it's really necessary here. Let's start with Behold the Man. A lot later on, well, actually, while John is writing this gospel, and some people think this is one of the reasons why John wrote this gospel, there's a lot of false teaching that has arisen. And still we see some of this false teaching today, which claims that Jesus was not really human. He was God, maybe sometimes inhabiting some kind of human-like form, but he was just spirit. And these were the Gnostics. That's what they believe. In fact, Paul is likely writing the book of Colossians, arguing against that, talking about the humanity of Christ and the importance of that. But the Gnostics kind of said, now, Philippa, you are beginning to be very distracting with those toys. You need to sit quietly, please. Thank you, sweetie. One of the things that they said is, you know, Jesus could not have been taking on human flesh because that would have made him sinful, because they believed that humanity, flesh is sinful, which it is. That part is true, right? But they said that God cannot inhabit a sinful fleshly body, so therefore, all flesh is bad. Jesus could not have been flesh. But it is important for us to establish the humanity of Jesus, because if he was not human, he could not die for us. And that brings us back around to this. He had to represent Adam, because Adam represents all of us. If not for Adam, you and I would not exist. We come from him. And so if God is going to die for us, first of all, God cannot die by definition. Humans can die, so God has to be human in order to die. But if he's going to die for us, he would have to be human to represent us. It would be the equivalent of someone saying, you have the death sentence, here, we'll kill this cat for you instead. It does not really compare, right? So it has to be an equal substitution, a valid substitution, which is also why the writer of Hebrews spends so much time saying the blood of bulls and goats can't really take away sin. It had to eventually lead to the death of a human, which is why God told Abraham, sacrifice your son Isaac. But then he didn't, because a better human sacrifice would have to come, because a human just couldn't die. Like, if I died for you, it would not matter, because I'm also not God. So my sacrifice might be worth something, but not worth an infinite amount of sins that you have charged to your account. Only God can do that. And so he has to be a man in order to die for us, and he also has to bear the curse away. So we're going to talk more about that as we get later into John 19. But this has to be something where the curse is defeated and separated from us so that we can have complete freedom over it. It can't just be a symbolic death. He has to take away the curse legally from us, and we're going to see him do that. So it's really significant. The crown of thorns, he's bearing that. He's like, I'm about to take on your curse. He's literally taking it on his head, but he's going to also then completely, literally remove it from here on out. So, sorry that's pretty deep, but important.
After this morning when the guy that's going to talk about Mary said defensive,
Yeah.
which made me think, God, Jesus never defended himself.
Yes.
You know, he just answered questions, but he didn't defend himself.
So let's add something else on the board here with prophecies. Prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling. And one of these is Isaiah 56. And another one is Isaiah 52 and 53. These are the passages where Isaiah begins to predict the suffering servant, and that's a big theme within Isaiah. And this is why some of the disciples, or the disciples generally, misunderstood Jesus so much when he was talking about suffering. They didn't realize that Isaiah predicting the suffering servant was messianic. They believed that, the Messiah would come and build the kingdom, and they didn't realize, he's also going to suffer and die on our behalf. That was they missed that part. There were some scholars at the time, ironically, the group that actually got us the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were called the Essenes, and they lived kind of as monks and copied scriptures and stuff. They believed there were going to be 3 different messiahs, and one of them was going to be the suffering servant. One of them was going to build the kingdom, and I forget what the other one was going to do, but they broke them. Yeah, maybe there you go. So there was a lot of confusion on that. But if you look through these passages, you're going to discover the floggings, the mocking, the plucking out of his beard, the slaps in the face, the spitting. All of that is predicted in great detail in these passages. But what's also mentioned in these passages as well is like a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he was. He did not argue back, and that's why it's so significant when he doesn't answer Pilate's question there at that moment. Where are you from? He's silent. He's not being defensive. He's not arguing back against them. He's not destroying them like he could. We saw last week that this cohort of 600 soldiers comes up to him, and just in his response, I am, or I am he, they all fell to the ground. Wow. That's good as well. All right. So we have kind of here talked a lot about verses 1 through 5 so far. Before we move on from 1 through 5, anything else that you want to bring up or any questions that you have there? Okay, let's move on then. Hit a few more things in 6 through 16. Do you remember the story of how Israel got a king? Because for a long time they didn't have a king, right?
They asked for a king.
Yeah, they asked for a king. What had they had before that time? Could someone give us a summary? And we'll get into this in our Old Testament. Judges, right? Yeah, they had judges that helped them. They had people like Moses, the lawgiver, and Joshua. They had these different leaders, but they didn't have a king. And how did they ask for a king? They wanted a king, but what words did they use? Do you remember this part?
king like all the other nations.
Yeah, they looked around at all the other nations and they're like, we want a king like that. And Samuel, who was their judge at the time, was like, well, okay, let me lay this out for you. He also rebukes them for asking for a king because God, they had these judges, but basically God was their king, right? So already the people of Israel, they rejected God long before Jesus came on the scene. And that's very clear, right? So they're rejecting God as king, and they're like, we want to be like the other nations. And so Samuel says, hey, if you get a king, he's going to take your sons and daughters. He's going to take the best of your crops. He's going to, taxes are going to come. Like, he lays out all the things that kings do. And they're like, we want a king. We want a king. See any parallels here? Here's your king, Pilate says. And then they say in verse 15, so he says, here's your king in verse 14. In verse 15, take him away, crucify him, right? Imagine the same kind of situation with, we don't want God as our king anymore. They're just going right back. And then they take it even further at the end of 15. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. So here...
They denied everything at that point. They
Right.
just gave up and turned it over to the Romans and Caesar.
That's right. So now we're even rejecting not just God establishing kings for us, but now we're rejecting all of that. We're going to subject ourselves to Rome. Wow.
And they didn't like it.
Yeah. Romans are the pagans, right? Like, they allowed this system of worship. What's so ironic, and I think, Alan, you had kind of brought this up, like, these are the chief priests, these are the leaders. The chief priests are the ones who are representing God. They're interceding on the behalf of people to God. They're in charge of the worship systems, and here they are rejecting God.
They became so focused on eliminating Christ, they gave up everything.
That's right. That's right.
And didn't God communicate to the chief priest with the thing they wore?
Mhm.
So you just wonder, God can't be speaking to them now because they've gone so far astray.
Mm.
If that chief priest goes into the Holy of Holies, they might have to use that robe.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I think his grace and mercy, God's grace and mercy, shines through here because we do see God communicating to the high priest. Remember, the high priest several chapters ago said it's important that one man die for the people. And he heard that from God. God actually spoke to the high priest and told him that prophecy. And I just think that's incredible because that man was not using that prophecy for good. He had a sinful heart and was planning to crucify the Son of God. And God spoke to him, really, that prophecy's for us. And he's still prophesying to this guy. Wow. So he was speaking. But the other thing, too, is God had ceased to speak to the people for 400 years. Between Malachi and Matthew is a period of 400 years of silence. Okay? And you actually, if you look at the writings of the Jews during that time, like in the book of Baruch, for example, it says, the prophets have ceased to speak to us. That's one of the quotations from that book, which was written during that time. And so they were looking for God to speak. And here's God in flesh speaking to them. And how often did he speak with the chief priests? And they're rejecting him, and he keeps doing it and doing that and still rejecting.
That's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
We're just not at this, we're not putting God to death again, but we're certainly not obeying.
Yes, we struggle with that sometimes too. I know that it's sad and it's kind of negative, but just as a positive reminder, this is something we studied, it's been a long time now, but you remember in Acts, one of the passages that's just so beautiful is that at one moment, he just has this little line that says, and some of the priests believed. And it's just like, yes, because we see him rejecting so long. And then finally, and I don't remember the exact event that happens, but then at that point, then some of the priests believe. And it's like, finally, they're coming around. It's really cool. Okay. There's probably more, but let's move on in John 19. Let's look at the end of verse 16. They handed him over to be crucified. Then they took him away. Verse 17, carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had a sign made and put on the cross. It said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read the sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. And so the chief priests and Jews said to Pilate, don't write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. But Pilate replied, what I have written, I have written. We're going to take that part and talk about that a little bit. This continues the relationship of Pilate to these priests. And they're now worried about image. They're like, you put on the cross that he's the King of the Jews? He's not our king. But it really seems here, tell me what you think about this, it really seems here that Pilate is kind of like intentionally doing that because yeah, he's poking it because he was like, they're like, he's our, here's your king, and then we have no king but Caesar, and they're really pushing him into this. So he's like, fine, King of the Jews, and they're like, no, change this, and he's like, too late, man.
Well, and I think Pilate's kind of covering himself with Rome.
Mm-hmm.
For kind of not doing it exactly right.
Good point. Yep.
Because the King of the Jews would be insurrection.
Oh yeah. He cannot have a King of the Jews. Can you imagine that? Yeah. Dear Caesar, today I did not crucify a man who was claiming to be king, and
I won't go over well.
You're a Roman citizen.
True. Yes, crucifixion is reserved for non-citizens, especially slaves and insurrectionists. So. Yep.
This is also probably a warning to others, don't try to be the King of the Jews.
That's right. Yep, absolutely. Crucifixion is meant to be a public display of the wrath of Rome, which is interesting, which is going to lead us back here to this curse here in a minute. Okay? We'll get there in a second. But yep, so that's an interesting one. And again, like, Pilate must have a way with words. What I have written, kind of reminds us of the law, right? And, yeah. Okay. Anything else from this section?
Was there any prophecy about Jesus doing miracles?
Good question. Last time I studied this, it was very light on the subject, so I was kind of surprised by that. And the only one that I can remember off the top of my head was it talks about those who live in Galilee have seen a great light. And actually, yes, there's also a passage. So you remember we actually looked at this earlier in John. John the Baptist says, hey, wait a minute, like, I'm in prison right now. Are you the one who's to come, or are we going to expect somebody else? And Jesus says, go tell John that the blind have received their sight. And he starts listing some of the miracles. That is a prophecy as well. And I forget off the top of my head where that is, but there's a place that kind of lists some of those things out. And then there's a third one that has come into my mind right now. Jesus stands up at one point. He goes into a synagogue, which he always would do, and they invite him to come up and give the message, which essentially was he would read a passage from Scripture and then expound on it a little bit. And so he goes up and starts reading out of Isaiah, this prophecy that basically is like, I've come to set captives free and do this, and then he sets it down, and his only commentary is, today this passage is fulfilled for you. Like, I'm the fulfillment. So yes, there are, and I'm forgetting the specific passages. It's usually safe to say for things like that, Isaiah.
Isaiah 35.
Thank you. Yep. Yeah, we should go back and review those, because there's a lot of them. There's so many of these prophecies. He fulfilled, over like 300 prophecies, I think. So it's a pretty remarkable list. here's another one that he fulfills. So we talked about Adam as a type, and we said Isaac is coming. So here's part of Isaac. I mean, the whole Isaac is easier to see than I think Adam is, and it's a lot simpler. So it's this entire crucifixion section, but the big place where we pull this is in verse 16 and 17. Then they handed him over to be crucified. They took Jesus away, carrying the cross by himself. He went out to the place of the skull, which is in Aramaic Golgotha. So he's going up this hill, and remember, Isaac is going up this mountain, and Isaac, just this little line that Moses throws in there, he's like, and Isaac is carrying the wood, right? So the wood for the sacrifice. He's carrying that up by himself, and it's the instrument by which he would die. If that sacrifice, right, he would be a burnt offering. He's carrying that up himself, and here's Jesus carrying the execution device up the hill. And so there's that connection. Any thoughts on that?
You know, it never says anything that Isaac
Yep,
was scared, even, you know,
that's right.
and you think about, because he said get on the wood,
Mm-hmm.
and Isaac never, like, I would be a little upset.
He ties up Isaac.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I would be yelling. I would,
Yep.
like, why, Dad? You know?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So another thing we could put here, and we're not pulling this explicitly from the text, but Jesus is going willingly. Like we saw him in the previous chapter, he could have wiped out the entire cohort, but he didn't. He went willingly with him. And actually, I forgot to bring this up, but they then tied him up. Do you remember that? So that would be the other one. That's another good parallel that somebody mentioned. So he is a willing sacrifice. If you want to add the tying up part, I think that's good. That's from chapter 18. Verse 12, chapter 18, verse 12. Then the company of the soldiers, the commander, and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus and tied him up, after he had just struck them all to the ground by words. Yep. And I've always wondered, and I don't think it's very clear, I'd have to go back and look, but how, Abraham's old, right, at this time. Isaac seems to be a young man. Now, we don't know exactly how old he is, but I've heard some scholars speculate that he could have been in his 20s at the time. And again, I don't know. I'd have to look up the details there. But I think it would be pretty easy for Isaac to overpower old Dad, but then Dad still ties him up. But he's a willing sacrifice. So that's really fascinating.
Faith, both of those, Isaac and Abraham had.
Yeah.
Because Isaac had to have as much faith
To be willing.
to be willing.
Yes. The other thing, which we'll get to in a future time when we talk about the resurrection, which is coming, very exciting, is that Hebrews tells us, we don't see this in Genesis, but Hebrews tells us that Abraham knew, like he was willing to sacrifice Isaac because he knew God could even bring his son back from the dead. He didn't know God was going to say, no, don't kill him. He expected he was going to kill him. And he's like, I know God can raise him back from the dead because God gives life. And that's what we are going to see with Jesus. So that's another link. Okay. Anything else from verses 17 through 22? Right. Making it one step at a time. Except we're about to get into the deepest part. So, here we go. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, a part for each soldier. And they also took the tunic, which was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. And so they said to one another, let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who gets it. And this happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that says, they divided my clothes among them, and they cast lots for my clothing. And this is what the soldiers did. Okay. So that is, I love this because John actually tells us the exact verse to go to here, which is great. This is Psalm 22. And even if we didn't get it in Psalm 22, you know that Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That should give us a good hint here as well. But I'm actually going to read Psalm 22, and I encourage you to turn to it. This is just a beautiful passage, and just think through then as we get into this section, how many specific details in Psalm 22 Jesus fulfills in this next coming verses. Okay? my God, why have you abandoned me or forsaken me? Why are you so far from my deliverance and the words of my groaning? My God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, yet I have no rest. But you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Our ancestors trusted in you. They trusted, and you rescued them. They cried to you and were set free. They trusted in you and were not disgraced. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by people. Everyone who sees me mocks at me. They sneer and shake their heads. He relied on the Lord. Let him save him. Let the Lord rescue him, since he takes pleasure in him. And when we see in Luke and Matthew, the crowd actually does this. John doesn't record the same details, if I remember correctly, but we do see like people actually do that. The word that they use is they wag their heads and laugh and mock and use these exact words. And I have to wonder, it's like, did they know they were quoting from this passage? Just that's incredible right there. It was you who brought me out of the womb, making me secure at my mother's breast. I was given over to you at birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. Don't be far from me, because my distress is near and there's no one to help. Remember, all the disciples abandoned him, right? Many bulls surround me, strong ones of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths against me, lions mauling and roaring. I am poured out like water. We'll get to hold that thought. I'm poured out like water. All my bones are disjointed. And if you've studied crucifixion, that's what happens as your body is hanging there. Your bones are all out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. Again, hold that thought. We'll come back to that one. My strength is dried up like baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. They've put me into the dust of death. Dogs have surrounded me. A gang of evildoers has closed in on me. Check this out. They pierced my hands and my feet. Do you realize this was, I think, 1,000 years before the Persians invented the early forms of crucifixion?
My God.
That was not a way people were killed. So piercing my hands and feet that's kind of a strange statement. But it's predicting the crucifixion. I can count all my bones. And check this out too. People look and stare at me. They divided my garments among themselves and cast lots for my clothing. Goodness. Wow. We're actually going to stop there. There are a few more in this one, but this is the song that's going on inside of Jesus' head, his relationship with his Father. The internal dialogue that's probably happening is now God is separating himself from Jesus at the cross because of sin. But so many fulfillments right here. So if you're like, I don't remember all the prophecies of Jesus, just remember Psalm 22. That's a good one right there. You get a bunch of them for free.
Does any place say about how the world goes dark for those 3 hours?
I would have to
'Cause
look
I
that
don't
up
ever
again.
remember that, but I don't remember a lot. So,
I don't remember if I have that on my computer here or not, but I'll see if I can find it real quick.
Are you asking, is history any place in history?
No,
Because it's in
in
the
any
Bible.
place prophecy that
No,
before.
prophecy.
Oh, the
In
prophecy,
prophecy.
okay, I was thinking in history besides what the Bible says.
Let me see if I can find. I think I have these in the cloud, unfortunately.
I couldn't think of it, but just everything else has been prophesied about it, so I didn't know.
Yeah, the only thing that I can think of that's close is referring to how Herod kills the kids and the weeping that's there.
The
But
Passover.
yeah. Oh, here we go. Here's prophecy. Parentheses. Okay, so we'll need that one. All of those. Okay. While that's opening up, we'll hit a couple more things. Then I'll see if I can find that. I got my prophecy list, and I can also, Alan, if these open up, give you some more specific things about miracles here in just a second. Forgot I have my computer right here that has the notes. Yay. Okay. Let's see. We talked about dividing the clothes. Let's see if we can get to. No, we do not have time to get to that. So, anything else before I get to answer some of these questions on the prophecies that have just pulled up here?
Joel 2,
Yes.
chapter 2, verse 31.
Uh-huh.
The heading is the day of the Lord, and it's, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. Verse 31, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon
Yes.
to blood before the
Is
coming
that
of the
John,
great and
chapter
dreadful
2,
day of the Lord.
What chapter? What is
Joel
it?
2,
Joel.
31.
Mhm.
Joel.
Yep. That one is one that's going to be fulfilled twice. That's also at his second coming. But yeah, yep, that's a good one.
32 what?
Thank you.
31.
Thank you, Becky.
I'm skimming through here to see.
Amos 8, 9 through 10, I don't know if this is talking about that. In that day declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth
Amos
in
what?
broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping.
Where is that?
Amos.
That's a good one
9
to
through 10, but
look
I'm not
at.
sure if it, huh?
I think that's a good one. I have not studied that one in detail to see if it connects here, but we'd have to look at. So the times that they use are very different. So we have to look at what time was he crucified. I think they led him out to be crucified at noon, which is their 6th hour. So I don't think that's when he died, but it's pretty close. So that kind of makes sense, and it's also a religious festival. So that interesting. I do not have any other passages on darkness on my list than has already been said. So I think that's, I'm going to look in one more place here. There are some passages about earthquakes on the great and terrible day of the Lord as well. That's not on my list, but if you bring those ideas together, then yes. Could have that one. I'm looking to see about miracles here, if there's anything else that we didn't do. Alan, the verse, and anybody else who's interested, the verse about miracles is Isaiah 35, 5 through 6. Isaiah 35, 5 through 6. And when John the Baptist goes to ask him that question, that's in John 5. Okay. All right. Good. Great stuff. Let's see if there's anything else we want to mention here, and if we're at a good stopping point. This is probably as close as we can get to a good stopping point without bringing up other big ones. But one of the biggest things that we're going to talk about in this entire passage happened. We'll get into this next week, where we go into verses 31 through 37, where Jesus actually dies. And we're going to connect that back to chapter 22 or Psalm 22. And we'll also look at a number of other passages that are prophecies that he fulfills there as well. And then that's going to bring us back to this idea of the curse and how now we can actually have a legal way to be saved. So this is not, as some people might lead you to believe, that, oh, it's just willy-nilly, and you just have these symbols that you talk about, or it's all abstract. It's a legal agreement that he has been able to get around here. And actually, I mentioned Esther earlier. It kind of parallels Esther a little bit. There was this unbreakable law that said the Jews are going to be slaughtered on this day. And even the king could not break that law because he had made it in a binding way. And that's a great parallel for our sin. And then he finds a way around that legally by saying the Jews can fight back. And then they end up slaughtering their enemies. And so we're going to see some other legal things that happen, and it has to do with this curse and the death that Jesus died and everything. So
Now, did this occur when it was gonna be Pentecostal, right?
Pentecost
Yeah, was it
for Esther.
for crucifixion?
Oh, for crucifixion. This is the Friday of Passover,
Passover,
and
okay.
Jesus dies right about the same time the Passover lamb
Yeah,
is
'cause I was
sacrificed.
thinking it also, that's another type.
Yes,
Pentecostal
that's
to
right.
crucifixion.
Yeah, that's right. Is he fulfills the Passover lamb, and then they go into a 7-day Passover week festival that happens as well, which is also significant. So,
So
anyway,
instead of
yeah.
just saving the children, he's saving the world.
Mm-hmm. That's right. He is the firstborn son. That also corresponds to Adam. That instead of your firstborn sons dying, he dies in your place, and really all the people, right? They put the blood on the doorpost, and that's actually going to come back around as well in this next bit. So we'll come back to Passover next week. We've just started scratching the surface of this passage, so come ready to eat again next week as well. Let's pray. Lord, it's kind of overwhelming sometimes, all the details here and all these passages and prophecies that you fulfill, the types that you fulfill, and just all of the scriptures coming together in the crucifixion. This is like, it's almost as if the entire book was leading us to this point, which it is. And we thank you for that. Thank you for your sacrifice on the cross. Thank you for the death that you died in our place. Thank you that we can now live spotless lives, and we can live lives that glorify you because of this, and that you're always with us no matter what we're going through or the sufferings that we have. And also, just as a side effect, you understand our sufferings more than anybody else. You yourself suffered, and you can sympathize with our weaknesses. Lord, I thank you for that. Help us as we continue to just think about these passages this week and what we've looked at, that you would help us to apply it to our lives. We ask in your name. Amen.